Well, thank you. That's another great set of inputs there into what is, for me, a very, very exciting journey I think we've started on. For some of us, we've been at this for frustrating 15 years. And I think this project is kind of, you can almost touch it now. It's there. I'm fed up with talking. And it's about getting something done that's real and you can actually, has a purpose. Through the Green Growth Strategy and the Cost Challenge Task Force last year, moving into the deployment phase this year, I think we're going to hear, I hope that we're going to hear some clearer ways forward, some strong signals that will be suitable and acceptable, palatable to investors, be they debt, be they equity, over the course of the next 12, 18 months or so. Anybody else have a view on that? I have a view. I think, whether you like it or loathe it, if you look at wind power, all its skeptics and doubters and detractors, after it basically was supported by government. It's to the point now where it's break even. If you go back to electrolyzers already at 10 megawatts, Shell are already building 10 megawatt electrolyzers. That will transform that industry again. This is about a journey of belief. And it's about recognizing you've got to pump prime this. And it will get to the point eventually where because value drives everything, it just does. But you've got to start somewhere. So I think it's a combination of, yes, there'll be value and companies will come in and do it, and where they don't, government has to find a way to pump prime to get this going. No. It purely looked at resource use in a kind of do-nothing case and those three CCS scenarios.
That's a very good question indeed, and I'll just give a very brief insight from my experience of some of the work that was done in the Netherlands. And the short answer is that it was seen as being helpful as a starting point to kind of clarify the kind of action that was required. So in Rotterdam and the Rijnmond, I won't go into specifics in case I say something that's wrong, but certainly, as there is in the Netherlands as a whole, there have been some quite clear sort of goals and aspirations that have been set out for climate action at the local level. Whilst it came up in the discussions that happened in the Netherlands that there needed to be more clarity on what the role for CCS was, it was certainly a starting point, a good starting point, something quite tangible for people to say, well, what does responding to climate change mean for our sort of local area? And what are the specific technologies, pathways, and actions that are going to get us there? And that kind of gives, I think, as you say, a sort of springboard for saying, well, how might CCS fit with a local narrative, as opposed to it being something that's kind of distant and sort of nationally managed and not connected to the local area. So in short, it's not something that really came across for Scotland and the North East, but certainly with the Rotterdam experience, it helped to facilitate that discussion. The main issue that we had with the unions, and I will be careful not to name names, is that in Scotland there are still, as you say, we have some large and influential unions who, when you speak to people in private, will be quite sympathetic to the need for action on climate change. However, publicly, given perceptions around climate mitigation and what the effects of that might be on jobs, it can be difficult for some of these unions to propose and pass motions expressing support for climate change. As regards how that relates to CCS, my sense of it is that when one speaks again with unions at a one-to-one level, there's interest and there's sympathy. The challenge as I see it is maybe to kind of raise awareness among some of these unions of what the specifics of CCS are, what CCS actually involves in practice, and what role it might have in balancing these climate and also employment imperatives. So, for instance, I suppose in short, the awareness within a lot of the trade union reps I spoke with was comparatively low. They were sympathetic and they were interested, but the real knowledge gap, I think, is what does it mean for jobs? It can specifically be say, how many jobs this is going to either preserve, create, or maintain. What might these jobs be? And very specifically, do the skills that already exist in, say, oil and gas industries match up in reality to the skills and the jobs that are going to be needed to make CCS happen. So yeah, in short, yes, there's sympathy, but in terms of knowledge, awareness and data, there's a lot of work to do.
So the monitoring costs were looked at. So what wasn't covered in the kind of whirlwind storage discussion was we actually ran for both sites a leakage workshop or containment workshop. So really looking at all the different potential migration pathways or the carbon dioxide could potentially move out with the store and kind of putting a risk assessment on that. And then from that kind of building a monitoring plan for both of the sites as well. So monitoring plan was developed for both of the stores and was costed as well. So not in the, actually I think one seismic survey is in the capital costs, but the operating costs, the MMV or monitoring, measurement and verification has been included as well. So it is within that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I can comment on that. I mean, really from a personal perspective, I suppose, whereas CCS was at one point just seen as okay, this just prolonging the oil and gas industry. But I would say definitely, the last year, the conference in Edinburgh in November, I felt like there was a real change and a real kind of push forward, and people really beginning to see CCS as definitely part of the solution and not kind of an excuse for prolonging. And I think Bellona made that point in their talk.
So during the course of the project, we've produced so far 20, and ultimately there'll be 21 reports. All of them are on the project website. Details are on there. The storage development plan budgets that Hazel referred to have got the cash flow in those. So you've got the CapEx, the phasing of that, the OpEx, the MMV costs when they happen, the handover costs to the competent authority. The costs are all there. I mean, the question really is, what is society willing to pay in order to in order to mitigate the effects of climate change?
The thing that strikes me about the modelling activity is that we can gain a lot from what's already happened from the oil industry in the North Sea. So there's a lot of data out there that has already been developed. When we do modelling for oil field systems, we start from very little knowledge, and that's actually when we need the models the most, when we're making big decisions. In this situation here, we've already got a lot of data. Richard is showing excellent data. That piece of rock on the windowsill there has come from the Captain field in the North Sea. We wouldn't have that if the oil industry hadn't been doing the work. So that data has helped to constrain these models a lot. There's a lot of uncertainty in the models, and it's very helpful that we're able to constrain and reduce that uncertainty. So we run lots of scenarios, and we try and ensure that the most probable outcomes all lie within the range of scenarios that we run, and that helps to minimise the amount of uncertainty that we have. And the way I think of it is, if you come into this, I bet you no one came into this building today with the concept that when they came into this room, there would be magma underneath their feet. But there is. It's a long way down, and but we have uncertainty. We don't know exactly how that magma is moving around, but the uncertainty is constrained, and so we don't worry about it. And I think the same applies with our modelling activities for CO2 storage. There are uncertainties, but we know how to constrain those uncertainties, and we know that there are limits on it. And we've been very good at doing this in the North Sea. So we've drilled, so we've found cap rocks like that one that's on the windowsill there, with buoyant hydrocarbons underneath them hundreds and hundreds of times, and done it very, very successfully, and been able to model those. So I think to answer the question, the modelling philosophy is to look at a range of scenarios. We can't constrain it completely to one single scenario, but we look at a range of scenarios, and we ensure that the range of scenarios covers all the possibilities that might occur.
If I just make a comparison with other CCS sites, we can see that in Norway, Statoil started off with Sleipner site, but then Statoil Equinor moved up to Snøhvit, and they had two sites. Effectively, they had a prime site and then a backup site. The prime site didn't work quite as well, but they understood the subsurface well enough to move to the backup site. So the whole project performs very well. And I think part of the point with this project is there are multiple backup sites already within the Captain Sandstone, between the Atlantic and between the Goldeneye. And there's a whole swathe of backup sites in the May Sandstone that the project's evaluated. And there are multiple seals on the top. So this is actually really, really resilient suite of storage structures, which shows extremely good promise of performing, even if the geology is not quite perfect the first time, with all the knowledge Eric's talked about. We can be very, very confident that enough of that geology will perform all of the time to be a secure and safe store.
CO2 is a very useful resource. And so the question might be asked, if in 1,000 years' time we decide that we actually want to bring this stuff back out again, how good could we do that? And the answer is actually very, very difficult, because the rock retains it. That rock there is very good at holding back CO2. This would not be a good place to put CO2 if you wanted it back again. So we have looked at studies. I think if there is ever a CO2 leak, it will probably be through a hole that human beings have drilled through the rock. It's very unlikely to seep out the rock. But I think we spend far too much time talking about leakage scenarios. If we get some volcanologists in the room, they'll talk endlessly about that magma down there, because that's their area of interest. And so we're interested in leakage scenarios. We talk a lot about it. The fact is, I think, that it's very unlikely ever to occur. And if it does occur, there are mitigation strategies that we can take place to address that.
I think he's right, actually, that if you're talking about 1,000 years, it actually mineralizes in the seawater. However, we'll come back to that question.
I was also just going to comment on that as well. So you may well be aware, but there are experiments. The Otway project is one of those where they do this huff and puff where they pump in the CO2 and then they try and pull it back out again. And there's one up on Svalbard where they're pumping into a sandstone that actually, if the CO2 just migrates up the sandstone, it'll come out onto just out to free air. And I think those projects are really designed to look at how the CO2 just is trapped in the pore space, and as you flush it through, it's just all left behind. So it's actually, as Eric was saying, it's actually quite hard to get out once you start to put it in. And I'll just pick up on Eric's point about wells. We've also did a little sub-project work at Aberdeen looking at well and well integrity from the data that is in the CDA database. So we have also started some of that work just to looking at how many holes there are in that we have drilled into some of these potential aquifers.
A similar point as to before, we've got a lot of data from the oil and gas industry. So we can constrain our models from the production histories that we have from the fields that are in those same systems. And for example, one of the boundaries is a fault which runs right through the Captain field. And the Captain field has held down hydrocarbons, buoyant hydrocarbons, for tens of millions of years. So you can never have 100% certainty, of course, but given the data that we have, we've got a very high degree of confidence that those systems will hold, because they have already held hydrocarbons for long periods of time.
Yeah, so I think there's another way of looking at this, and that the oil and gas that was in those fields that were present on Hazel's maps, that oil took tens to hundreds of millions of years to migrate there. So fluids do move in the subsurface, but they move really slowly. So as soon as you move away from the injection well, the pressure differential diminishes and the rate of fluid movement decreases exponentially as you move away from the injection site. So the ability to move right beyond the end of the play we looked at is probably very unlikely, given other geological analogues, and the easiest is oil and gas migration.
So can I just ask you to thank the panel for answering those questions?